Good day. Another day and more conflict in Ukraine, in this conflict that seems to be dragging on right through the summer, and which nobody expects to end anytime soon. Briefly, the latest updates from the Battle of Donbass. I think that's how one should refer to it. I mean, clearly there's been various elements in the battle. There was the battle for Mariupol, there was the battle for Popasnaya, there was the battle for Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. But overall, we must talk about the Battle of Donbass. It is proceeding in exactly the same way as before. And yesterday, the Military Summary Channel did a further discussion of the enormous weight of artillery fire being rained down on Ukrainian troops trying to defend the two important towns of Bakhmut and Siversk, which between them now form the last line of defense of the Ukrainian army in Donbass before the Russians finally envelop Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, the two cities where I understand the command of the Ukrainian army in Donbass is based, and where the Ukrainians have the remaining troops in Donbass, which continue to try and cling on to Donbass on behalf of Ukraine. So much fighting in this northern part of Donetsk region, northern and eastern part of Donetsk region. Bakhmut is actually located in a sort of southern position to Slavyansk, but Siversk in the north, Bakhmut in the east, they form a kind of line, taking in another town called Soledar, which is now the line that the Russians, having captured Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, are gradually advancing towards. And I've been reading some rather strange claims in parts of the Western media about how there's supposedly been a quiet day yesterday in the Battle of Donbass. Accounts from the ground don't bear out that picture at all. What seems to be happening, on the contrary, is intensifying shelling by the Russians of these Ukrainian troops, who are now suffering these horrendous casualties that I discussed yesterday in my previous video. It's the typical pattern that the Russians have followed throughout this war, at least throughout the Battle of Donbass, at least. Methodical, systematic destruction of Ukrainian military formations in the field, with the Russians then, once these Ukrainian units are badly battered or essentially destroyed, then advancing, sending their infantry to take more ground, capture more settlements, until gradually the entire Ukrainian defense system collapses. That's what happened in Mariupol, it happened in Popasnaya, it happened in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, it's happening again along the line Siversk, Soledar, Bakhmut, and once that line has collapsed, the last place of defense, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, will undoubtedly experience the same kind of tactics, the same methodical Russian tactics, leading to the collapse of Ukrainian forces there as well. And that will leave any Ukrainian troops still located facing Donetsk in that line of defensive positions, or rather fortified positions that Ukraine created opposite Donetsk. That will leave any Ukrainian troops unwise enough to stay there, or ordered to stay there by the authorities in Kiev. that will leave those Ukrainian troops in an impossible position, essentially cut off from the rest of the Ukraine and in danger of encirclement. And once Slavyansk and Kramatorsk fall, that will mean, in effect, the effective end of the Battle of Donbass. And as has been pointed out by the Military Summary channel in earlier programs, with Slavyansk, Kramatorsk fallen, with the Battle of Donbass in effect ended, that will then leave the Russians with no major obstacle for a further westward advance until they reach the Dnieper River, where the great city of Dnipropetrovsk, as it used to be, Leonid Brezhnev's birthplace, by the way, until that place is reached, well to the west of the place where the battles are taking place now. Now, whilst all that is happening, whilst Ukrainian defences are being ground down in Donbass, whilst the Russians appear to be applying similar or identical tactics elsewhere further north in Kharkiv region, using smaller forces but also slowly grinding down Ukrainian forces that defending Kharkiv. An interesting fact, by the way, and one that does make one wonder whether Kharkiv might be an objective for the Russians, the first objective for the Russians once Donbass has been fully captured. I'd previously thought it might be Zaporozhye, the city of Zaporozhye, but the latest Russian actions may suggest that Kharkiv is also high on the risk of targets. And of course, Kharkiv is Ukraine's second biggest city. Were Ukraine to lose Kharkiv, indeed were it also to lose Zaporozhye, another major city, then I think we could definitely say that Ukraine would be facing a major crisis. Anyway, whilst these actual events are taking place on the ground in Donbass and in northern Ukraine, the media in the West, the media in Ukraine, Ukrainian government officials, President Zelensky's security advisor, his defense minister, other officials of the Ukrainian government continue to talk up and endlessly talk up the prospect of this great Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kherson region. And I'm going to say straight away that I've heard two completely conflicting, contrasting views about this Ukrainian counteroffensive. One, on our live stream with Dima of the Military Summary channel, appeared to assume that this military offensive, this counteroffensive in Kherson region, is a real plan, that the Ukrainians really do intend to execute this counteroffensive, and that they've been building up forces with the genuine and real intention of launching an attack all along the front line, maybe not to recapture Kherson city, that might be beyond their reach, but at least to push the Russian forces that have crossed the Dnieper River, to push them back to all the way back to the east bank of the Dnieper River, or if not, better still, to destroy them west of the Dnieper River. So that's Dima of the Military Summary channel's point of view. By contrast, Olga Shari, who is a Ukrainian journalist, extremely well informed about Ukrainian politics, a very acute and intelligent observer of Ukrainian politics. She's just done a video about this whole matter. It's in Russian, but the Seika website has provided an excellent translation, excellent subtitles. She takes the view that this is all media hype, that this is all a story being spun by the Ukrainian government to try to shore up domestic support for the war in Ukraine, but primarily to persuade Western governments to continue to cough up money and to provide Ukraine with more weapons supplies. And that, by the way, also seems to be the view of the extremely shrewd commentator at the new Atlas channel, who has pointed out that there are, just as I have done, that there are fundamental logistical and technical problems in putting together the kind of force that Ukraine would need if it were to carry out this kind of counteroffensive. And Olga Shari speculates that it wouldn't just be a case of a media hype in order to support the Western, to bolster internal support for the war in Ukraine, to maintain hope and faith of victory on the part of the Ukrainian people. That it's also directed very much now, not just at getting Western military supplies, but also Western money and financial assistance. And perhaps in support of her claims, I saw that the Ukrainian finance ministry says that Ukraine no longer needs $5 billion worth of Western financial aid every month to keep its budget in some sort of sustainable form. It now needs $9 billion of financial aid every month. In other words, the amount Ukraine is now asking for has doubled. And I'm starting to get a glimmer of a sense that some Western governments are now becoming dismayed that at the sheer scale of Ukrainian demands for military and financial aid. They never expected that Ukraine would be coming back constantly, cap in hand, asking for more and more weapons, more and more money, and that there are some people in the defense ministries, in the finance ministries, who are beginning to become worried that this is turning into a bottomless pit, that Ukrainian demands will simply grow, that, to use John F. Kennedy's quip about Vietnam, about aid to South Vietnam, it's a glass of water, it's like a glass of water. You drink some and the effect wears off, and before you know, you need another. And it's turning very much the same way with Ukraine, that previously it was $5 billion a month, now it's $9 billion a month, shortly it could be $20 billion a month, perhaps $40 billion a month. They've now got at least commitments to 12 HIMARS systems, perhaps 18 multiple rocket launch systems from the West altogether. Perhaps the total number they're seeking, or at least that the West is apparently committed to providing them with, there's some reports it'll be 48 in total, and quite a lot actually, but they're asking for 300, which would be a sizable chunk of the total number of multiple rocket launch systems possessed by the West. They've already managed to wangle from the Americans something like a third of the ammunition stored by the US military for use by this system. And the number is going to just go on increasing, and they're going to demand more and more weapons and more money. And perhaps it's not entirely surprising that as these demands escalate and grow and get greater and bigger all the time, there's also some reports that the concerns are now being raised both in Europe and in the United States that there's no real accounting for what the Ukrainians are doing with all this money and with all these weapons. And there's been a piece about this in the Financial Times highlighting concerns in Europe about what's happening to all the weapons that the Europeans are providing, and I understand that there's been similar articles on this very same topic starting to appear in the United States. And it may be that what has triggered these latest articles, at least in the United States, is reports about which, by the way, I am skeptical, that the Russians have managed to buy from corrupt Ukrainian commanders at least one intact HIMARS system with a significant amount of its munitions. Now, I have to say straight away that I want a lot more confirmation of this story than I have seen up to now. So far, it all amounts to internet chatter. So I'm not assuming that it is true. But it seems that previously some corrupt Ukrainian officers did indeed sell to the Russians intact French Caesar self-propelled howitzers, and that these are now being examined and tested and looked over by Russian specialists at the giant Ural Vagon Zavod factory in the Urals. And who knows, perhaps some sort of corrupt deal has been done to sell a HIMARS system. It does seem extraordinary, but it's not completely implausible. And whether or not that story is true, there's no doubt at all that there is a lot of weapon systems supplied by the West that is now appearing on the dark web, apparently being sold or resold by all kinds of corrupt and nefarious individuals who've managed to gain access to these weapons. So it may be that all of this coming together is starting to cause alarm in Western capitals. And the alarm may be growing, given the fact that up to now, these weapon systems that have been supplied to Ukraine in such enormous quantities, and we're talking about billions of dollars of weapons, have not made any significant difference on the battlefields. And obviously, in Donbass, what we see is a steady Ukrainian retreat. We see that Ukraine's forces in Bakhmut, Solidar, and Siversk are being battered to pieces, and that the Russians are looking towards further advances beyond this last line. They're looking to further advances towards Slavyansk. They're actually pretty close to Slavyansk in some other places. And there doesn't seem to be any real sign of Ukrainian progress anywhere else. Now, maybe there will be this great counteroffensive in Kherson region. I'm going to say that I come somewhere between Olga Shari and Dima of the Military Summary channel. I think that it would be a complete collapse of Ukrainian credibility, if Ukrainian government credibility, if there was no attempt to launch a counteroffensive in Kherson region. So I think some kind of counteroffensive will eventually be launched. But I strongly suspect that this counteroffensive will be a combination of a real counteroffensive and a media campaign, rather like that counteroffensive we heard about in Kharkiv region back in May, one that will completely fail to achieve any significant objectives, that will be more theatre than reality. That's my guess. I may be wrong. But anyway, that's what I think we're going to see. Certainly, there is now growing analysis, including in the West. I've recently seen a more recent analysis, that Ukraine just doesn't have the trained manpower, the equipment, above all, the air cover to carry out an offensive in Kherson region that would succeed against the Russian forces there. And the major problem, again, is that it would be operating, it would be taking place very close to the major Russian bases that have now been created in Crimea. The Russian Air Force is particularly potent here. The Russians are well supplied, not just with cruise missiles, but with supersonic cruise missiles like the Onyx missile system that they have in Crimea. It would be very, very difficult to sustain an effective offensive in this area, given the problems, the logistical and other problems that Ukraine faces. I'm going to say something else. We've now seen more use of the HIMARS by Ukraine. There was a big HIMARS attack by Ukraine on what the Ukrainians claimed was an ammunition depot of the Russians in Kherson region. The Russians, by contrast, say that it was a fertilizer warehouse, an entirely civilian facility, and that a number of civilians were killed as a result. As a general rule, I try to avoid coming down on one side or the other on these claims. I don't have access to the sites, so I can't really say. But it is interesting that the United Nations criticized this Ukrainian attack and seemed to support the Russians, that this was indeed a civilian facility and that it was not a military facility. Now, unless this missile strike, if it really was a civilian facility, unless this missile strike was simply intended to frighten the local population, in which case, by the way, I suspect it would be a war crime. Unless that was its purpose, then the fact that the Ukrainians apparently attacked a civilian warehouse housing saltpeter and fertilizer, presumably thinking it was an ammunition dump, that suggests that the intelligence that they're receiving, presumably from the United States, is not particularly well informed about what is going on behind the lines in Kherson region. There is, of course, another possibility, which is that this attack was launched in order to test and to learn more about the Russian air defense system in this area. But on the other side, it's clear that what the HIMARS strikes are doing is that it's teaching the Russians a great deal about the operation of the HIMARS system. And it's clear that the Russians are able to shoot down HIMARS missiles. They've now done so in increasing numbers. As I've discussed in my previous program, the Ukrainian tactic now is to try to saturate the Russian air defense system by launching lots of other rockets, including Grad and Uragan and Smerch systems, rockets, in other words, from old Soviet-type rockets, sometimes a number of Tochka U's, and then, whilst the Russians are reloading, to launch HIMARS systems, thereby penetrating the defences. It's a clever tactic, but perhaps a rather obvious one. And it's one, I think, as I said previously, that the Russians are sure to find a counter to. The fact that they can actually shoot down these HIMARS systems, I never doubted that they would be able to, by the way, but the fact that they can do so, and the fact that the Russians must now be getting a fairly clear idea of the kind of targets that the Ukrainians are going to try and use these systems against, all of that suggests to me that it's only a matter of time before the Russians do devise an effective counter to this system. And when I say only a matter of time, I mean perhaps a week, 2 weeks, a month at most. So there we go. That's, I think, where we are with the HIMARS systems and with the situation in the war. Incremental, steady, grinding Russian advances in Donbass. Ukraine continuing to suffer massive casualties. I think the 1,000 a day, dead and wounded, is perhaps roughly right. Doesn't seem as if that's changed. And a counteroffensive planned for Kherson region, which seems to be a blend of fiction and fact, one that's highly dependent on the HIMARS system, which may be less effective than the Ukrainians expect, and which, and with the Western governments, or at least officials in Western governments, starting to worry that Ukraine is becoming a bottomless pit. Well, that's where we are. We are now starting to see some other movements. Firstly, the Russians seem to have won a clear-cut victory over the Kaliningrad issue. Apparently, there's been a joint document agreed by the EU and the Russians, which the Russians say fully satisfies their concerns over Kaliningrad. So this attempt by Lithuania, I'm absolutely sure, put up to do it by the US, or at least by neocons in the US, this attempt to block land transit from Russia to Kaliningrad, that has clearly failed. I repeat what I say. There will be long-term consequences. The Russians have now seen that there is a potential for Lithuania to try to obstruct road and rail traffic from Russia to Kaliningrad. And they will start to take precautions, and they will start to prepare for the eventuality that such a blockade is reimposed. And that is an ominous development. It can't be undone. I'm afraid that a new point of conflict has been created, even though, for the moment, wisely, the Western powers, the European Union, has acted to defuse it. That's the first thing. The second is that there's been some movement around this issue of releasing Ukrainian grain and food. In other words, of enabling Ukraine to ship grain from Ukrainian ports. Some kind of negotiation going on in Istanbul about this. The Russians have consistently said that they're not seeking to obstruct Ukrainian food exports. And there's some suggestions that there's been some movement in terms of this issue. Now, I think that the Russians here are simply trying to expose the fundamental, fictitious element of this whole story. As Putin has repeatedly pointed out, the Russians have not sought to obstruct grain or food exports from Ukraine. They did not mine Ukrainian ports. They did not attempt to interfere with commercial shipping from those ports. Ukraine, according to the Russians, did so. You can agree with that or you can disagree with that, but that is what the Russians say. But the point is, and this is what the Russians also say, that the amount of food that Ukraine can export is just a tiny drop in what would be needed to make a fundamental difference to the global food crisis. The problem is not a stoppage of Ukrainian food exports. It's complications, problems with fertilizer, the fact that there have been restrictions on exports of Belarusian fertilizer products, problems with exporting Russian fertilizer products, and the fact that because of the slowdown, the reduction in natural gas use, there's been insufficient amount of natural gas, which is an important product used in the production of fertilizer in the West. And that's what the Russians are saying. And the Russians, I think, have been trying to make this point repeatedly. But of course, the Western powers, very unwilling to relax any of their sanctions, have instead been raising this issue of Ukrainian food exports. So what the Russians are trying to do is that they're trying to take this issue of Ukrainian food exports off the agenda. And they've been saying what needs to happen instead is that the Western powers need to address the problem, the fertilizer problem. And I have to say, looking at all the figures on this, it seems to me that there's little actual doubt that the Russians are right about this. And I don't think that I'm the only person who thinks this. The EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell, recently lamented that it had become very clear at the G20 summit that the global south is tilting towards Russia over the Ukrainian conflict. And I've no doubt that one of the reasons for this is that the Western powers have been trying to blame the food crisis around the world, which is of course especially affecting the global south, on this Russian, largely fictitious Russian food blockade of Ukraine. And, well, perhaps the Russians have not been encouraging Ukrainian grain exports, but I'm sure that people in the global south can count the figures and they can see the logic of the point the Russians are making. And the problem, as the global south sees it, is not that the Russians are obstructing food exports, but that it is the West, or at least the Western sanctions, that are complicating the whole issue of the production and supply of chemical fertilizer. And this perhaps brings us to what's happened in Sri Lanka, because the Sri Lankan government, perhaps commendably, tried to move towards organic farming. But most people, I think, looking at what's happened in Sri Lanka, feel that this was done in a disorganized and over-hurried way, that there was insufficient fertilizer, that this has caused food production in Sri Lanka to fall, and that this is partly one of the reasons why Sri Lanka is now experiencing the economic problems that it is. Well, that may have led most people around the world, most people in the global south, to feel that it is the Russians who are right, that it is chemical fertilizer, or rather the shortage of it, that is the problem. And the fact that instead of acknowledging this, the Western powers instead harp on about Ukrainian exports and a Russian blockade of Ukrainian exports, I suspect has damaged Western credibility and meant that many people in the global south are now becoming increasingly skeptical about everything that the West says about the conflict in Ukraine. And I think if that's right, and I suspect it is, that people in the West need to think about that very much and try to understand that stories like this about Russian food blockades may make powerful headlines in the Western media, and they may have some sway on Western publics. But there is a larger world, and the larger world, the greater world beyond the West, is capable of, as I said, doing the sums and arriving at different conclusions. And if a story like that is being spread, which, as I said, doesn't mathematically add up. The damage to Western credibility isn't limited just to what is said about the specific issue. It damages credibility more widely. That's why I think the Russians, who've always insisted that they've never sought to obstruct Ukrainian food exports, that's, I think, why the Russians are trying to come to some kind of compromise with the Ukrainians to allow ships to leave Odessa, because it has to be Odessa, with food. Now, I don't think that this is going to be an unrestricted exit of ships. The Russians apparently do want a right to inspect them. There'll be Turkish Navy will be involved in some form. So there's still a lot to discuss and negotiate, but some progress, at least, is being made on that front. So we've seen some progress on Kaliningrad, some progress on the food issue from Ukraine. There's the third and very complicated issue of this turbine, the Siemens turbine, which was sent by Siemens to Canada, which Canada refused to repair and return to Nord Stream 1 because that violates Canadian sanctions. Now, the Canadian government, under intense urging from the German government, has agreed to waive the sanctions, to provide a sanctions waiver, and to release this turbine to Siemens so that it can be provided to the Russians, reinstalled in Nord Stream 1, and get Nord Stream 1 working again. Except, of course, that there's now a legal challenge. And that legal challenge is coming apparently from Ukrainian groups urged on to do so by the government of Ukraine, but Ukrainian groups in Canada. All I will say about this at the moment is that if these legal challenges work, and perhaps they will, I'm not an expert on this area of the law, but if these challenges work, then once more we will see the extraordinary degree to which there's this mass of contradictions involving the sanctions and the way in which the sanctions are working against, ultimately, Western interests. And we've now had a spectacular demonstration of this, because inflation in the United States has risen again. Apparently there was expectations that inflation would indeed rise once more. There was expectations that it would go up to 8.8%. It's gone up instead to 9.1%. The inflation readout for June has been worse than expected. And I want to stress again, this is inflation according to the official figures. Most people, myself included, well, perhaps not most people, but many people, and certainly myself included, believe that the official readout of figures for inflation in the United States understate the reality of the problem, that the real inflation numbers are greater than these figures suggest. And that in turn means that real wages in the United States are falling, that the United States, like Britain, like other countries in the West, is now experiencing a cost of living crisis. And I've previously explained that despite denials from all sorts of people, I personally have no doubt that the Ukraine war, the sanctions war, the economic war of attrition is now playing a significant role in intensifying, accelerating the inflation problem. And this brings me back to this next issue, because of course there is now a huge tremor, a frisson across not just Europe, but the whole West, about whether on the 22nd of July, when the refurbishment of Nord Stream 1 is completed, whether with or without the Siemens turbine still in Canada, whether the Russians will turn on Nord Stream 1 at all, whether in fact Nord Stream 1 will remain closed for refurbishment and repair, or whether the Russians will find some other pretext or reason to keep it shut. And at that point, Russian gas supplies to Europe will plunge to not quite zero, because there's still a certain amount of gas flowing to Europe via the pipelines that crisscross Ukraine, but that's a tenuous amount of gas. And there's now been some concerns that the Russians might do something else, that they might actually start to stop supplies of oil to Europe. Now, this is particularly ironic because, of course, just a few weeks ago, it was the Europeans who announced an oil ban, an oil import ban, an import ban on Russian oil. It's at the moment limited to seaborne supplies of oil, and it's only supposed to take effect at the end of this year. Oil via the Druzhba pipeline to Hungary and other places is supposed to continue, but even that oil supposedly eventually is supposed to be phased out. Well, there's now a tremor of fear that the Russians, who are now comfortably able to find alternative suppliers for their oil. Brazil has just come forward and says that it wants to start buying diesel oil from Russia, that the Russians might switch off oil to Europe. And there's serious alarm that if the Russians do either of these things, if they keep Nord Stream 1 switched off past July 22nd, and if they stop oil exports to Europe, that will plunge Europe into a crisis, a terrible crisis in the winter. Well, for the record, I don't personally think that the Russians are going to do either of these things. I think that from their point of view, they are comfortable with the situation as it is. I think they feel that it's working quite well for them to have the Europeans take a certain amount of gas and a certain amount of oil. It gives the Russians quite a lot of money, and it reinforces the picture that the Russians still want to give, that they don't politicize their gas and oil trade, that it's other parties that do it, that it's never them who uses oil or gas as a weapon, political weapon. It's their European rivals who do it, and that any problems caused by the politicization of the oil and gas trade, that's entirely the fault of the West. But if I am wrong, if the Russians do, contrary to my expectations, entirely switch off the gas and the oil, and if that does plunge Europe into crisis, and if this causes a further spike in inflation in Europe and major problems in the European and British economies, especially over the winter, and if that causes more problems in the United States, well, I have to say I won't be surprised. And I will also say this, that I think that, once again, I say this so many times, this wasn't properly thought through by the Western powers when they launched that economic war of attrition against the Russians in February. At the end of the day, they always assumed, they seem to have assumed, that what they did would devastate the Russian economy and that the Russians would never dare to respond in kind. The Europeans, especially, the Americans to a great degree also, seem to have this illusion that they can impose sanctions on others and engage in what is in effect economic warfare against others, but that those others will never retaliate against them in kind. Well, quite possibly, over the course of the next few weeks, they will discover otherwise, apparently with all the devastating consequences that we are hearing about. If so, then I would like to think that they would learn the lesson from this affair. Europe and the United States ultimately are the major beneficiaries of the international trading system. Disrupting it puts them in danger, perhaps more than anyone else. They have a vested interest, in other words, in making it work properly, and they should be the last people to seek to disrupt it. Whether they're capable of learning that lesson is, of course, another matter. Anyway, let me finish this program by repeating my age-old mantra. I don't know what the Ukrainians are going to do, whether they are going to launch this great offensive in Kherson region. I don't know what emergency steps, what steps the Russians might take, whether they cut off the oil and the gas. I don't think they will, but perhaps they'll surprise me. They've surprised me in many respects over the course of this economic war. I don't know what, if any, steps the Europeans and the Western powers can take in response. But what all of them should do is that they should face the realities that whatever they were hoping to achieve in Ukraine and with Russia back in February, it isn't working. Ukraine is paying a terrible price in war and death and destruction, and it's seeing its economy destroyed. And the Western powers are now facing an economic crisis that I suspect back in February they in no way anticipated. In face of all of this, they look like rabbits caught in the headlines of the oncoming juggernaut. They don't seem to know what to do. More of the same isn't working. The solution isn't more HIMARS, and the bewildering nature of the problems caused by the sanctions is exposed by this pathetic farce over the Siemens turbine in Canada and the legal challenge to the waiver. They need to find a diplomatic solution, to do it fast, and that dictates the need for negotiations. Well, whether they are able to listen, whether a new British Prime Minister, for example, might be willing to chart a new course, very unlikely, almost inconceivable in my opinion, whether a change in the government in Germany might bring that about, I don't know. We shall see. But the sooner this fact is grasped in the West, the better it will be for everyone. Thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me again in future programs on this channel. And please remember the announcement I made yesterday that one of our channels, Alex Christoforous, has run into the old sort of problems that people who try to provide channels, provide information on YouTube, constantly have to worry about and face, and the result is that he's not publishing on his YouTube channel for a week, though he remains fully active and engaged and committed on all our other platforms. And that should encourage you, it seems to me, to go to our other platforms, above all to Locals, where we have a thriving community, but also to Rumble and ODYSEE, and above all Telegram and Super U and all the others. And in the meantime, Remember, you can also support us, support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, buying the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all the rest. And please also remember, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and also to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today as we discuss the latest events in this global crisis. And I look forward to you joining me again, and have a very good day until then.